Hello. I am Brooke Gladstone, and thank you, my peeps. This FEMA series, which is brilliant, I had absolutely nothing to do with, except for the fact that I work with amazing people. Micah Loewinger, the editor and producer, Eloise Blondiau, and Katja Rogers, who is the executive producer of the program and who made sure that the trains ran on time and edited and everything else. I am so happy to be working for these people who are so passionate. There's more people here, Travis, Becca, anyway. Oh, Candace, I can't see. I love my staff. I love the show. I love this series. And I really look forward to hearing it and not the series, but hearing what they have to say about the reporting. And before we get to that, you may not know this, but we're listener supported. Don't tell anybody. And if you're interested in becoming a member, and you're not, if you are now, thank you. There's the QR code. It'll tell you everything you need to know. Now I'm going to bring out another great name, Nancy. Come on out here, the legendary reporter Nancy Solomon.
Hey, everybody. Welcome. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Nancy Solomon. I used to work in the WNYC newsroom, covering mostly political corruption in New Jersey. Why they invited me to do this, I do not know, but I'm very grateful. So let me introduce. So tonight what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the making of the podcast. Why would a show about the media make a series about the Federal Emergency Management Agency? And why should we care? We'll also pull back the curtain and find out about the reporting challenges and how the team dealt with them. And we're going to take your questions at the end, so hang on to them. So let me introduce these folks. Micah Loewinger is the co-host of On the Media, heard on 400 public radio stations around the country. He began working on the show in 2016. Now, wait, but yes, you have a 10-year anniversary happening, don't you?
I do, yes, as of this month.
He became its first staff reporter for the show. And then his stories have focused on political extremism, internet culture, and the evolution of the news industry. He's the co-reporter and host of this series that is the topic for tonight. And it had roots in a huge story that he broke about Zello, a walkie-talkie messaging app used by far-right militias, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Eloise Blondiau is a co-reporter and producer for American Emergency. And she's the senior producer for On the Media. Before coming to WNYC, she was a producer on the podcast Plague, The Untold Stories of AIDS in the Catholic Church. Eloise is probably not the only one, but she's fairly rare in the world of journalism that she has a degree in divinity. Pretty cool. And our third guest and panelist is MaryAnn Tierney, sitting here in the middle. She spent 15 years at FEMA as a regional administrator for the region that is Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, and Washington, D.C. Pretty big job. MaryAnn left FEMA in May of 2025 in a major exodus of leadership there. And while at FEMA, she was deployed to numerous disasters. And she worked in emergency management in New York before going to FEMA. Now MaryAnn's plying her craft for SEPTA, the public transit system in Philadelphia, which is in the middle of a World Cup experience at the moment. So she's pretty busy. So thanks so much for coming up here and joining us. So let's start with you, Micah. Why FEMA? Like, take us to the beginning of this idea that you wanted to make this series.
Yeah, so FEMA. Why FEMA? I, as you mentioned, had been very interested in this walkie-talkie app called Zello, which is kind of like, I don't know, like a Facebook group meets WhatsApp. You can send little short messages to people. And in the summer of 2020, I started listening like obsessively to these militia groups, far-right groups, that would use the app for organizing and recruitment and all this stuff, and I could just listen to it from my home. And I started to learn a lot about like the beliefs and the ideology and the conspiracy theories that animated these groups in the lead up to January 6th. And I also noticed an interesting pattern that nobody else was really talking about, which is that the 3%ers, the Oath Keepers, white supremacist groups would go to natural disasters like, floods, hurricanes, wildfires, and they would help out, ostensibly as like volunteers. And it was really confusing to me. I'm like, why are they doing this? And with some time, I started to realize, especially after January 6th, that a number of the high-profile people who were convicted for the insurrection had started a militia after a natural disaster, had used a natural disaster to recruit, or had used it to raise money. And I started to see this connection between the growing problems with extreme weather and climate change and far-right movements. And so why FEMA? The militias hated FEMA. They were sometimes butting heads with FEMA people on the ground, and they told wild stories about FEMA. The big one that we talk about in the series, and kind of my way into this, was like the FEMA camps conspiracy theory. This belief that FEMA was going to round up political dissidents and put them in concentration camps, take their guns away, use FEMA as the vehicle for some kind of global authoritarian plot. And I didn't know anything about FEMA, and I was like, that FEMA? Like the Katrina FEMA? And so as we started digging into it, and as we started hearing more about the Trump administration's efforts to abolish FEMA last year, I was like, there's something here. There's some kind of continuity. There's something below the surface.
Can you unpack that a little bit? Like, I can imagine a world in which these militias go to disasters, help people, and use that as a recruitment tool, but really like FEMA, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I could see that would be the one part of the federal government they might actually support. So what is it about FEMA that draws so much, and a lot of your reporting over the years has been on misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories. So can you kind of unpack that, like the misinformation, the conspiracy theories, and why the right wing hates FEMA?
Sure. There are a lot of reasons why the right and the left hate FEMA, which we can get into. These conspiracy theories about the FEMA camps, they harken back to an era where FEMA was really hiding a lot from the public. One of the things that FEMA actually did in the 80s is they were charged by the Reagan administration with developing doomsday scenario plans. So a big thing during the Cold War was like this question of like, what would we do if the majority of Americans died after a nuclear attack? And it sounds, very like a silly sci-fi movie, but there was a lot of actual planning that went into this question. And the Reagan administration, Ronald Reagan actually asks his head of FEMA to draw up plans for declaring martial law and suspending the Constitution so that FEMA could get the country back on track, get leadership back in place, take nuclear survivors, put them in refugee camps. So these plans, as they started to come out, and they were plans, never realized, but they were actually plans, once this started to kind of trickle into the public consciousness, they were picked up by conspiracy theories, right-wing and left-wing conspiracy theorists. Or maybe I'm calling them conspiracy theorists, but suspicious citizens who are like, what is our government doing, And so Alex Jones made many documentaries about the FEMA camps, and it kind of lived on as this like theory, very divorced from the real history, but one that animated militia groups and other, armed groups that were ostensibly interested in protecting their civil liberties.
one of the fascinating stories that you guys tell is about Mount Weather in the first episode, which is kind of the roots of some of this paranoia and conspiracy theory, right? That's an actual real thing. So Eloise, tell us about, the digging into the historical archives of FEMA and how you found this, and first tell us, what was Mount Weather?
Oh, Mount Weather. Mount Weather
This is it here.
Mount Weather still exists. It's an underground city in Virginia. It has a broadcasting studio. I think it has a hospital. It has pretty much anything you could possibly need to keep a big group of people alive. And the reason it was created was to preserve continuity of government. So the idea was, hey, let's say, a nuke hits, how do we make sure, everything doesn't fall apart? Let's send our most important people to this bunker to survive, to keep America alive. And we kind of came across Mount Weather in particular because, me and Micah were talking about, how do we tell this history of FEMA where it really was defending against nuclear war before, natural disasters. It was always kind of doing the natural disaster work too, but there was a time when nuclear disaster was its priority. And we found this book by Garrett Graff, which is called, he's a historian, it's called Raven Rock. And I think I'm paraphrasing, but the subhead is something like how the most powerful people in America made plans to save themselves while the rest of us die. Like, that's the thesis of his book. And he gives the history of, Mount Weather is one of many of these secret bunkers. But we were particularly interested in Mount Weather because it had an interesting introduction into the public imagination, which was in the 70s, there was a very tragic plane crash that happened very close by to Mount Weather. And people only realized that something weird was going on because the federal agents were immediately on the scene. So that's how the public found out about Mount Weather, which we thought was kind of a fascinating introduction. And obviously, as Micah said, this discovery sparked a lot more questions about what the hell is the government up to?
MaryAnn, did you ever go to Mount Weather?
That
been
is
inside?
very outside of my scope as a regional administrator. So yeah, I can't really say much about. Not a lot of information on that. I was busy with more the nuts and bolts of emergency management.
Okay. Okay, so let's talk about Katrina, which is the subject of episode 2. One of the main people we hear from is Siobhan. And we have that is Siobhan. And tell us how you found her.
Yes, so this episode, we're telling the story of what happened at the Superdome, which was where a lot of residents in New Orleans were sent to kind of ride out the aftermath of the storm. And we had already, Micah had found this amazing former FEMA worker who is one of the only FEMA workers on the ground, and he was at the Superdome. But we wanted to obviously to also tell the story from the perspective of a survivor of Hurricane Katrina. So obviously one of the challenges with making this episode, I don't know if Micah, if you want to share anything, but people feel like they know what happened during Katrina. So our challenge was, how do we tell a story that maybe people haven't heard before, or how can we introduce them to a person they may not have heard from before? So the hard thing is that there are so many documentaries about Katrina that we really wanted to make sure that we weren't just kind of picking up someone who'd done a ton of press before. So how do you do that? We, not being in New Orleans. First thing, I reached out to some oral history projects in New Orleans to see if they might want to connect us with anyone. And then I obviously scoured the internet, and there were a lot of people on the 20th anniversary of Katrina who were sharing their experience of the storm. And
On TikTok,
on TikTok.
which we have.
And one of those, I saw so many videos, but this one in particular stuck out.
All right,
To
we're
me.
not going to play the whole thing, but it gives you kind of a taste.
So I'm gonna talk about my stay in a Superdome for Katrina and how horrible it was to relive that trauma all over again. We was in the Superdome for 6 days. When I arrived the first day, I went to the Superdome the day of Katrina, after the levees broke and the city was submerged underwater.
All right, we're going to stop it there. There's New Orleans after Katrina. So it wasn't easy to get Siobhan to talk with you, though, as you have told me. So tell us
Yes.
about that.
Well, one of the reasons I liked, there are a lot of people who have similar videos. The thing I loved about Siobhan's video is kind of immediately when you watch it, you feel like you know her. And it was the first time she had told that story. She was very detailed. She had, which, is like a reporter's dream because you can, verify things. It was 20 years ago. So it has to be someone who can recall things in a vivid way. Siobhan made that TikTok because it was the first time she'd ever shared her story about what she'd been through in Katrina. And she had watched a documentary and felt that it was time. And for us, it felt, it's hard when you talk to someone who's gone through something traumatic because you don't want to re-traumatize them. You want them to want to talk to you about what happened to them. And she actually wasn't too hard to convince. I kind of didn't want to convince her, to be honest. I just sent her some messages on TikTok. Initially, she said, she had a few questions for me, and we had a little phone call beforehand. But actually, what was meaningful to me about kind of us choosing Siobhan to kind of tell this story was that it was meaningful to her. She was finally ready to talk about it, which I think is really special, and I think it makes the story, it gives it more weight when you hear it.
Yeah.
And she also had these crazy narrative details, which are also a reporter's dream. Like,
The storm hit on her 19th birthday.
yeah.
So she and her block were having a big party just hours before the city was completely submerged.
Yeah, I think that.
And then she hadn't celebrated her birthday for a decade and a half more.
Yeah, 15 years, yeah.
She refused to celebrate her birthday because she felt like, how could I celebrate when all these people died on my birthday?
Yeah, so she made that TikTok, I think the day after her birthday, because she'd been thinking about it.
Yeah. And she'd had a birthday party for the first, or she talked about having a birthday party for the
A
first
few
time.
years
Maybe
before,
it was before
yes,
that. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
But no, I felt very, very honored that we got to share her story.
So Katrina really represents this kind of pivotal moment in the history of FEMA because it's widely recognized that the guy that was running it, Brownie, as George Bush called him, who had worked for a horse company, a horse farm or
Horse
something.
breeding organization.
It was,
That he was
competition.
really not, he did not have the necessary expertise. And so actually Congress does something about that and says, no, you have to have somebody who has experience. So it's kind of a pivotal moment. Am I missing something, or tell me more, Micah?
Well, we had focused on these kind of weird, strange fringe reasons why people hate and don't trust FEMA. And we felt like, well, we have to talk about Katrina because it's a legitimate moment where all kinds of people were, hundreds of thousands of people were actually failed by government dysfunction. But I'd be curious to hear from you, MaryAnn, about what you saw change at FEMA after Katrina, or what you witnessed in the world of emergency management, how it metabolized the mistakes of Katrina and sort of vowed to do better.
Yeah, I think, one of them was the passage of the post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act, which included the stipulations that the FEMA administrator have a certain level of emergency management experience. It also required the same thing of FEMA regional administrators. the idea of kind of professionalizing these very key positions within the agency. There was also, I think, a lot of introspection in emergency management around how do we prepare for people that are the most vulnerable, people that are marginalized every day, that live on the edge of society, and then a disaster either prevents them from acting because they lack the resources or the wherewithal to take action, or afterwards are pushed over the edge, right? I've seen that many times in disasters, whether it was in New York City or when I was in Philadelphia or at FEMA. And so I think there was also a big move towards thinking about how do we plan for those groups of people, not just have them kind of off to the side, but how do we integrate them into our thinking and response operations? Also, I think a big look at ingesting lessons learned. You know, there were a lot of things before Katrina that were known about a significant hurricane impacting New Orleans. There was an exercise very close to Hurricane Katrina called Hurricane Pam, where many of the things that happened in Katrina played out in that exercise. But a lot of the lessons learned from that exercise were not acted upon in a timely manner. And so thinking about how, as a profession, as a set of public agencies, how do we learn from our exercises? How do we learn from real world events? And not just learn it and put it on a shelf, but learn it and ingest it back into how we do business. I think that was another key takeaway. And I think the last thing was being more survivor focused. How do we ensure that our programs, our processes, everything that we do is oriented on how are we helping survivors move through response to recovery?
Was there ever acknowledgement from within the agency that New Orleans was a poor Black city and it had been basically, ignored on its worst day, that there was, virtually no FEMA response for the first few days?
Well, I wasn't at FEMA during Katrina, so I really can't speak to what was happening inside the agency during that time. But what I can say is that Katrina loomed large across FEMA from the time that I worked, all through the time that I worked there, almost to the kind of the detriment of the agency moving forward. And I saw some of that play out in Maria, where there were so many concerns about fraud and risk, which was an issue in Katrina. We did have some instances of fraud with some of the things that FEMA did to rapidly help people, that it almost became something that held us back. And so there was another person at FEMA, and we would often talk about kind of the sins of Katrina playing forward in the agency, and that in some ways we had to kind of move past that in order to improve our systems and processes.
So we, the audience, meet you in episode 4, which is largely about the sort of post-Trump world of FEMA. And I want to get to that in a moment, but I thought it would be really interesting to hear about your experience in New York as part of emergency management here in the city, because from what I understand, you were working in emergency management on our city's worst day.
Yeah, so I was with New York City Emergency Management from 1999 to 2006, was my first emergency management job. And OEM, that's what we called it, OEM, was a very small agency when I started, and we were located in 7 World Trade Center, which in hindsight was probably not the best place to put an emergency management agency. And actually, it was when I interviewed, I asked them about that, because the World Trade Center had been bombed in 1993, and I had asked hey, what's the plan here? But I was assured it was, it was good. We were good. And then 9/11 happened, obviously, and it was, an extremely traumatic event for the entire city, for city government. We lost 343 firefighters, 23 police officers, 30 members of the Port Authority Police Department, and countless others, right, were killed on that day and continue to die as a result of illnesses born from the toxic stew that was around Lower Manhattan in 9/11. So it's not just something that happened on 9/11, it's something that continues to happen regularly. I know colleagues that are dying from cancer, so it is still kind of a big impact to many people that responded to 9/11. And that really changed how New York City responded to disasters. And grew emergency management. And from 9/11, many things, even at the federal level, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the grant programs that support countless state and local governments to prepare for disasters, to prepare for Homeland Security events, all came from 9/11. And it was like like Katrina, it was a watershed moment in American history in the profession of emergency management, and things were never, kind of never the same after that.
Okay, but I was hoping you might tell us the story of what you were doing on that day.
What I was doing? Well, I was working. But I don't know if you were alive in 2001. That was election. It was a primary day. So we were voting, and then I was on my way to work, and I got a call. I was late for work because I was voting. And so I thought the person calling me was upset that I was late because we were actually having an exercise the next day. Like a bioterrorism exercise was planned for the next day. And so I thought I was in trouble. But it was to tell me that something had happened at the World Trade Center. So I went to 7 World Trade Center and went up in the Emergency Operations Center, which was located in 7 World Trade Center. And we were there.
It had already been hit. When
yeah, the first plane had already struck I believe it was the North Tower. And then we were in the Emergency Operations Center when the second plane hit the South Tower. And then we evacuated and we walked down the 23 flights of stairs, and there was a small group of us, a small group of city agencies were coming and arriving, and we were in the lobby of 7 World Trade Center when the first tower fell into 7 World Trade Center, which was a very unfortunate situation to be in. Do not recommend. And we had moved into like the garage area and then kind of popped out on the backside on Vesey Street. And then the OEM command post was there, and we got on the command post, and then a bunch of other people also got on the command post because they were evacuating. And then we ended up in the police academy for a couple of days because our EOC was destroyed. And then we were on a pier, and FEMA was on the pier right next to us. So if you were here in New York City in 2001, OEM was on one pier, kind of on the west side, and then FEMA had taken over the other pier, and we were working for months to, help the city recover, to clear the debris, find people, help identify them. It was a several months long effort to do all of that, and it kind of, the first phase of that really wrapped up in May of 2002. So that's what I was doing a lot of the recovery work, working with the Army Corps, I spent a lot of time with FEMA and the folks from FEMA dealing with a lot of the recovery aspects.
It must be just nuts to devote your life to this kind of work and then have there be this large segment of our population that is so against the agency. I can't even really imagine that.
But I think that's, in every profession or job, there's people that don't think that what you do is of value. And, I felt like at FEMA, the work that we did is extraordinarily important, even to this day. And just because somebody doesn't think that it's true doesn't mean it's what they think is real. I think, you have to think about, are you doing the best thing that you can do every day to help people and working on improving that? And if there's naysayers, then, I think our job is to convert them to yay-sayers. And, the militia is a really good example. I was deployed to Asheville for Hurricane Helene. I spent about a month there. And there were militia-like organizations that I engaged in order to help survivors. And I think part of the challenge in government is that when you see groups like that, the immediate reaction is to say, oh, no, I don't want to work with them. But, my thinking was Asheville, Buncombe County, North Carolina was ground zero for the impact to Helene, in addition to the counties around it, but that's the county I was assigned to. And here's this group of people, and, they're rough, they got guns, they're militarized, but they want to do the same thing I want to do. I want to help people. So our interests are aligned in the fact that we both want to help this community. And so how do we align our interests in a way where we can both help each other do that? And I think that in doing that, I built some really great relationships with some of those individuals, if I still stay in touch with some of them. And so I think you can't be afraid of people just because they're different from you or because you think that they're not, they have a different set of thinking. I think that's a big problem in this country, is that we don't take time to figure out how we can align our interests. And I found that was very successful in North Carolina, and I would absolutely do that again.
And so you end up in a very difficult position where after President Trump takes office, you have to work with the new director, Cameron Hamilton, to basically, come up with a plan to dismantle the whole agency. And this is, of course, during the whole DOGE, going through the whole federal government and cutting things. So what was that experience like, and how did you navigate those waters?
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously that was very unpleasant. Imagine if somebody showed up at your job and said, "No, we don't want that anymore." That kind of did happen to me.
Well, it happened. Okay.
Yeah, it did. So you can empathize. It's very jarring, and as somebody who, my job at the time when that happened, I was the senior career official at FEMA, and here we have this workforce of several thousand people who, know these things are happening to us, and I think part of our job was to provide stability and to be a buffer so that our workforce could continue to do its important work. And I know that Cameron Hamilton felt the same way. And again, our interests were aligned in that the agency provided and still provides a very important service to Americans on their worst day. FEMA is not, no government agency is, anybody who's worked in government, no government agency is perfect, and a lot of them are very dysfunctional. And FEMA has a lot of dysfunction that needs to be improved. But the people that work at FEMA, just like most government agencies, show up at work every day to try to help people. They want to do their job, and the systems and processes get in the way. And that doesn't mean that the agency should be put through the shredder. It means we should sit down and have a thoughtful conversation about what can we improve and what should we fix, and how can the people who work here every day and understand the pain points contribute to that fix. And I think I know Cam felt the same way because we talked about that. So getting direction to write a memo to abolish the agency, was very upsetting. But we were asked to do it, and we did it. And ultimately, it was not acted upon. The agency is still there. And is now going to go through some major reforms.
I thought it was so interesting. I can't remember the exact words of what you said, but I remember one of the clips of tape of you in the episode where you talk about how you understand that this is a political process. You're working for a political appointee who's going to do the bidding of his boss, the president, and that you just sort of, you had a certain acceptance that even though it wasn't what you wanted, you had an acceptance of the process, and that's what your job entailed.
Yeah, I mean, I think your job as a senior executive, especially in the federal government, it's a very institutionalized process. Your job as a senior executive is to support political leadership, and your job is to provide advice, right? And so the department directed us to write a memo to abolish FEMA, which obviously I did not agree with. But we did that. But in doing that, we provided advice about the challenges and obstacles that would play out if that was in fact done. And I think that was successful because ultimately it was not acted upon. But ultimately, I always felt like my job, I had done the acting deputy job twice. My job was to provide advice, and then it was their job to figure out what they wanted to do with that advice. And once they figured that out, my job was to do the thing they asked me to do as long as it was legal. And, I was never asked to do anything. I was never directed to do anything illegal. I was asked a lot of questions, and I would give advice about whether that made sense. But at the end of the day, no one actually ever asked me to do something that wasn't illegal. But I did ultimately leave because a lot of the things that were being done made me uncomfortable, which is different than not being legal.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's play a cut of tape from the series.
I remember being
I'm sorry, can we pause? I forgot to set it up, I'm sorry. So this is disinformation and conspiracy theories that lead to death threats. We're going to hear from Jacqueline Rothenberg, who worked in FEMA Public Relations, and it was during the North Carolina hurricane.
Yeah,
right?
Hurricane Helene.
Yes, I'm sorry. Let's start again if we can.
I remember being in FEMA's National Response Coordination Center doing my job, and a colleague pulled me aside in a small little room, and they said, "There's been some threats against you. We think it's unsafe." There was an individual in Alabama who threatened to shoot me, so a state that actually was not impacted by the disaster at all. And I I kind of just like, I got scared. I got really scared. And I remember calling my husband before I left, and I said, we need to leave the house.
Micah, do you want to jump in here?
Sure, yeah. So this is, we were interested in telling the story of Hurricane Helene because it's a very important recent storm that helps explain why the Trump administration targeted FEMA and threatened to abolish it. It's also interesting because after Hurricane Katrina, FEMA improved and evolved in many significant ways. And so even though the agency, according at least to the experts that we spoke to, did a decent job, a pretty good job of anticipating the challenges of the storm and then responding to them, that was not what the story about Helene was online. The story online was that FEMA did a terrible job, completely abandoned the people of Asheville and Buncombe County. And under Biden, because remember, this is fall of 2024, the storm hits just a month before the election, the story becomes Biden's FEMA doesn't want to help Trump supporters so that they will not vote for him. And FEMA has all these other motives to interfere with the election. So in this stew of misinformation and outright lies about the government's efforts, high up FEMA employees start to receive insane death threats. There were doxing attempts. Some people were swatted. If you don't know that term, it means like you call in a fake police report hoping that a SWAT team will bust down the door and like shoot the unsuspecting victims. People have died this way. It's very dangerous. So this is like the level of vitriol and violence that's being directed at the people who are trying to respond to the storm. Jacqueline Rothenberg was the head of public affairs. She gets this death threat. And so we were interested in telling her story because we felt it captured the fear of FEMA, but also the fear that FEMA felt of the people that it was trying to serve. And this is that kind of tension that interfered with an earnest effort to help people on their worst day.
And sorry, Nancy, just to add, Helene was a storm that saw unprecedented conspiracy theories. I think there were, MaryAnn, you probably know better than I do, but I think there were more kind of conspiracy theories about Helene than any other disaster before that storm. So it was particularly hard for Jacqueline to do her job because she was going out, on TV, debunking these conspiracy theories, and then going home and coming back into work, and they're telling her that actually now she's the subject of the conspiracy theories. It's pretty devastating for her. Yeah.
And so one of the things you came up with that you reported on was that there were much lower than expected applications for help and aid from that storm, but it turned out to be not an easy. It wasn't like a direct line, like, oh, people think that FEMA is bad and ineffective, so they're not applying for the funds. It was actually a much more nuanced, complicated story. You want to explain that?
Yeah, I think because Micah's original kind of entry point into this story was the kind of the militias and the conspiracy theories, I think that we did kind of imagine that there would be a super clear through line in a situation like this between, okay, lots of conspiracy theories, that's the sole primary driver of distrust in FEMA, and it was definitely more complicated than that. A lot of people didn't actually know what FEMA was doing. Like, they had done amazing work, but if you asked someone on the street, they didn't know that they got their water back because FEMA had fixed the water treatment plant. They didn't know that,
Well, I just want to say FEMA didn't fix the water treatment plant. The city of Asheville fixed the water treatment plant. What FEMA did help by providing technical assistance through the Army Corps, but I want to give the Asheville Water Department credit for doing that.
Thank you.
They thought that it was, I just want to be clear, they thought that was going to take several months, and they had the water back. They had running water back, within 30 days, which is why I was allowed to go home. And also, by Thanksgiving, people could drink their water again, which was a miraculous effort by that water department.
Could you tell us more about what FEMA did do that maybe people in North Carolina didn't realize?
Yeah, I mean, FEMA did a lot. We paid for all of the emergency response efforts, the debris removal, well, most of it, within the parameters of our program. We provided consumable supplies. In Asheville and Buncombe County, we set up, in partnership with the county and the state, stations where people could go and wash their clothes and take a shower. We provided a lot of support from an individual assistance standpoint. I think one of the challenges with FEMA is that FEMA is not very good at telling its story and explaining to people what FEMA does and what FEMA does not do. And I also think that the public has unrealistic expectations about what FEMA can do in the constraints of the law. For example, FEMA is not going to make you whole after a disaster. A lot of times, and again, this is where FEMA is not good at telling its story, when you have a disaster, FEMA will talk about, well, the maximum amount of money you can get it's $42,000. It adjusts every year, but right now it's about $42,000. So what does everybody think? Everybody thinks they're going to get $42,000 grant from FEMA, but they don't. And so when they call FEMA and they think they're getting $42,000 because that's what we put in our press release, and then they only end up with the average payout, which is less than $5,000, of course they are upset, because the expectations they have do not match the reality of our programs. And I think a lot of this starts with that.
Interesting. Well, let's talk about the librarian in Asheville. It's Asheville, right? Or somewhere in North Carolina.
Nearby, it's in Marshall, yeah.
So this is Gloria Sundquist, so tell us about finding her.
Gloria, we've kind of came across this amazing library in Marshall, North Carolina. The head librarian there invited FEMA actually to set up inside the library because she was seeing so many conspiracy theories and hearing about the distress, so she wanted a trusted place for people to interact with FEMA workers. By becoming acquainted with the library, we met Gloria, who is a circulation assistant, who had a kind of pretty dramatic survival story during Hurricane Helene, where she was rescued by boat from her home as it was filling up with water. And we wanted to talk to her about her experience applying for aid from FEMA.
Okay, let's play that tape.
I said, you're not equipped to deal with rural people. I said, I do not need a hotel voucher. I need rental assistance. I had a cabin up above me that people wanted $1,000 a month for a one-room cabin. I mean, they're just a bureaucratic organization that wasn't going to give you much for anything, really, and they required your lungs for whatever they wanted to give you. In the midst of all that trauma, how do people sort through that?
So, MaryAnn, you want to take a crack at, is it difficult for FEMA to differentiate between, say, what it takes to get into housing in a rural area versus in a city? Or, that's one of the things she's saying there.
Yeah, I think let's start with the FEMA Individual Assistance Program, which is the program that provides all the financial assistance to individuals and their families after a disaster is broken and needs real reform. And that FEMA, some of that FEMA can do on its own. Some of it Congress needs to act because some of it has to do with how our statute is written. And so there's that. But layered on that, FEMA we've made it very complicated. Government agencies love Rube Goldberg machines. If it can take 5 steps, a lot of times we figure out how to make it take 10 steps. And that is very frustrating for people. It's frustrating for people that work at FEMA. Our workforce is very adept at working around some of our processes to help survivors, but it takes a lot of energy to do that. So we need to decomplex those programs. They need real reform. I think that's one thing. When I hear her story, it breaks my heart because there are probably things that we could have done to help her if we had a better set of programs that were better integrated, if we had a better registration process. I also think, not knowing her case, I also think that there's probably some mismatched expectations about what FEMA could do for her in her situation. And part of what FEMA needs to do is to bring all of the stakeholders together to think about how we can help a survivor and weave that picture of need together for them. And then the last thing I'll say is that FEMA, one of the programs that's most complicated and most difficult is disaster housing, which FEMA is the lead for, and I believe that that is misplaced. FEMA is not a housing agency. There is an agency in the federal government who is responsible for housing, and I think that they should be taking more ownership of that post-disaster. Disaster housing is extremely fraught. When a disaster happens to a community and it destroys the housing stock, that is happening at a time where there's already an affordability crisis with housing across the country. There's a building crisis with housing across the country. We can't build enough houses in this country to meet the demand without a disaster. And when a disaster rolls through and destroys all of the affordable housing stock in a community, it is a very complicated thing to rebuild. And the federal government is one piece of that. But lots of other things come into play, and a lot of it is local politics about how you're going to rebuild and where that housing is going to end up. And what do we do for folks after a disaster who have lost their housing? And FEMA has programs to provide temporary housing, and I have seen in communities when FEMA has tried to do that, they have been met with significant resistance in putting that housing in place, because the people who have housing left don't want that in their neighborhood. And so it is, I guess to sum up, extremely politically fraught, and FEMA is put in the middle of that, and no one walks away happy.
Yeah.
And everybody walks away unhappy with FEMA.
We're running out of time, and I want to make sure we talk about Cameron Hamilton. So, Micah, you had this sort of extraordinary reporting windfall in that Cameron Hamilton was fired from his job heading FEMA by Donald Trump, I assume, right? And so he's out of a job and he's willing to talk to you, but he then comes back. So tell us about that.
That's right. And I'll be careful what I say because MaryAnn lived through everything. But Cameron Hamilton was chosen to be the acting administrator at the beginning of the Trump administration. He was kind of a head scratcher because he did not have a traditional emergency management background. He hadn't worked at FEMA for like a decade, like some of his predecessors. But stands up for the agency. He says he doesn't want to abolish it. He and MaryAnn are really put in the pressure cooker. Corey Lewandowski and Kristi Noem, they seem to think that abolishing FEMA is like their MO and that's what they have to do. Cameron Hamilton is polygraphed at one point under orders from the Department of Homeland Security. They accuse him of leaking things to the press. I'm just trying to illustrate just like how chaotic this time was last year, 2025. He ends up testifying that he doesn't want to abolish FEMA. He's fired. And so when we call him up in December, I just thought, like, let's have him tell this incredibly juicy, revealing story about where the agency is, the dysfunction in the Trump administration, the hell that they're putting the leaders through. And the man just talked, and we had like a really interesting, fairly candid conversation about his time in government. Now, when we were kind of writing the episodes, putting them together, trying to figure out the twists and turns, we learn that he has just been nominated to come back and run the agency officially again.
Major plot twist.
Huge plot twist. So, like, we could never have seen this coming. As far as I know, he's the only Trump nominee to have had this kind of, comeback story. And so it ends up looking like we're the only journalists that have had a sit-down interview with him about his time in office. He had been relatively cagey with other media. And so Eloise actually got a call from him just a few weeks before, or a couple weeks before the last episode was about to come out, and he asked us to not run the episode. He asked us to delay the release of the episode because he was worried it would interfere with his confirmation hearing. And we said, no. We said we're going to run the episode. I mean, journalism, ethics, very, very important. But just practically speaking, like, what were we going to tell our audience about the 4th episode? Like, sorry, guys. Like,
Right, I think episode 3 ends with a
yeah, we had already
saying,
like
we're gonna
teased
speak to Cameron
it. Yeah.
Hamilton next week.
Yeah. But we would, of course, we're serious about the craft of journalism. We're a media criticism show.
Yes.
We would never, ever let a public official tell us what we can or cannot run. And in fact, we recorded the conversation. We put it in the series. You know, having watched his Senate confirmation hearing last week, he had nothing to worry about.
Yeah.
They didn't ask him very hard questions, in my opinion. Questions about his qualifications for the job didn't come up. Nothing he said in our interview, boo-hoo, made it in. You know, so maybe that's just the state of D.C.
Okay, but let's hear from MaryAnn. You worked with him, and you did say you kind of like, you do respect him. You like the guy.
Yeah, I would say we're good friends. We bonded over a lot in that very, very long 5 months that we were together. Not because of him.
Do you think he'll do a good job?
I think Cam is a smart guy who cares deeply about the agency. I think he can, and I didn't know anything about his previous. When I met him, it was very chaotic. I didn't have time to like do some deep research on him. So I just met him and it was like, this is Cam, he's running the agency. And I was like, okay, let's figure this out. We were together, like, side by side every day. So I didn't know anything about him and his commentary before he came to FEMA. And I think, he had some opinions about FEMA. I found him to be very respectful and humble, and, he would listen to opinions and he would take that in. And, I think we worked really well together. And I think he's a person of integrity, which I think is important. I also think that the president needs to have somebody that he trusts, and FEMA needs somebody that the president trusts, especially now because the agency has been practically shredded and needs to come out of that. And having somebody that the secretary and the president are confident in is critical. And they're confident in Cam, and that will go a long way. And there are a lot of good people still at FEMA who are there every day doing their job that want to help reform the agency. So I know that he will surround himself with those people, and I know those people are dedicated to making sure that the agency can deliver its mission. So the whole agency doesn't rest on Cam Hamilton. The agency is a 4,000, 25,000 person workforce, and he is their leader, but there are many other people that are going to make that agency successful.
Well, that's good to know, considering we're coming up on hurricane season and fire season. And that's where I just want to squeeze in. We're out of time, but Mike, I really want to talk about sort of that one of the overarching themes of the whole series is sort of how political systems seize upon disasters and the relationship between autocracy and natural disasters. So talk a little bit about that and what keeps you up at night about about FEMA.
Yeah, I mean, well, I started a lot of the idea came out of this reporting looking at how far-right groups exploit climate disasters to sort of build their movements. And I kind of went in wondering if a diminished FEMA would create this sort of opening for more of these groups to kind of proliferate. A lot of them are kind of underground. We don't talk about them very much. They're a little bit less active. They're certainly less public. But I don't think it's controversial to say that like this kind of militarized authoritarianism is going to like continue to exist and grow in the future. And I do wonder that if when there is the next really big disaster, because there's always a next one, if FEMA in its weakened state doesn't show up for people, and the narrative that our federal government can't help people and will just fail them, if these types of groups will continue to have the story that they need to recruit and to raise money and to do with it what they will in the future. So I really hope not. And I really hope that FEMA gets its mojo back, gets its act together, because we need that.
Well, I will say FEMA has been responding to disasters for the last year and a half. I mean, there hasn't been a Helene level disaster, but certainly there will, and unfortunately there will be one in the next 2.5, 3 years. And
Months, probably.
yeah, at least one, which is unfortunate, but it's just how the nature of nature. I think, like again, there are thousands of amazing FEMA employees still there, toiling away every day. I think the morale is a significant issue. I think there are readiness things that are a problem. But if there is a big disaster, the people at FEMA will show up and they'll figure it out, because that's what they do in every disaster. Now, is it unfortunate that they're going to have to do that in an agency that is diminished? It is, because it's going to make their job harder and it's a worse outcome for the American people. I don't think that that's putting America first. And I think that now with Cam and his nomination, kind of on a track to be confirmed, there's a unique opportunity to do something different, because there has been so much that has been broken. And there is nowhere to go but to a different state.
Okay, well, optimism is a good place to end it. And I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I think we have a roving microphone over here. Anybody want to ask a question of any of our panelists?
Hi, my name is Molly Starkdean, and I'm a huge On the Media fan. And thank you. I'm also a Vermonter, 7th generation. So when I heard On the Media talk about Vermont, I nerded out. So thank you so much. But my question is, how did the Vermont really come into place? Like, what was the thing where you were just like, oh, this is why FEMA needs to exist? Because Vermont can't lean on itself to fund its own FEMA. What led to the Vermontness of this piece? Thank you.
Well, our last episode we were making about, we were thinking about the future of FEMA based on these recommendations that have been made by a review council, the FEMA Review Council. And the gist of the recommendations is that states should take more responsibility for disasters. We actually struggled figuring out how we wanted to get at the nuances of this story. We did feel like it was important to highlight a state that would struggle if that recommendation were enacted, and Vermont came up time and time again with different people in the emergency management world. And actually, it was really the 11th hour. I was calling up everyone at the Department of Emergency Management in Vermont, begging someone to talk to me. And we ended up speaking to the director, Eric Ferrand, and he told us about all of these really crazy challenges that Vermont has faced just in the last couple years. They've had these crazy floods on the same day for 3 years in a row in Vermont.
10th.
July 10th.
July 10th.
July 10th, yeah. So it's coming up.
It's coming up. Don't book a trip to Vermont next month.
But he told us that Vermont was experiencing a higher number of more severe disasters in the last 5 years than they had historically. And because of that, their budget and their infrastructure was not set up to anticipate and to recover from those disasters if there was a significant scale back. Vermont is rural. There aren't that many people that live there. There are fewer taxpayers. And he told us that it's people spread out, so it's hard to get people from one place to another. And I'm sure, MaryAnn, you might also have some other thoughts on why Vermont might be experiencing some challenges right now.
Well, I mean, I think any of the smaller states are going to have challenges in a big disaster because they're not resourced at the level of, say, a California or a New York. And in an era where disasters are more frequent and more destructive and our infrastructure is older and our population is older and has more needs, there is just a lot more need after a disaster. And I don't think, the bumper sticker is states have to take on more responsibility, but like anything, it's a lot more nuanced than that. There has to be there must be a rebalancing of the role of the state and the federal government in disasters. Over the years, FEMA has taken on more and more work that probably should be rebalanced to the federal government. Now, exactly what that looks like, I think that's part of what has to be discussed. But if you look at the trend of disaster declarations over the past 25 years, up until now, there's just been a lot more disaster declarations, and the states have become more reliant on that. They're also heavily reliant on federal grant dollars before a disaster to prepare. And so states have been put in a position where they don't have to make policy choices about the role of emergency management, how much emergency management they want to invest in, how much mitigation they want to invest in to reduce the risk and reduce the cost of disasters. And that's a part of what we need to talk about. Because FEMA cannot sustain the level of disaster activity and the level of work when FEMA is really designed for the truly catastrophic. That's what the agency should be focused on. And responding to every disaster in the country, which they don't. I mean, 99.9% of the things that happen in this country have nothing to do with FEMA. But FEMA does respond to a lot of things more than it used to. And there needs to be a conversation about that, because either FEMA has to be properly resourced to do all of that work, which it's not, or there has to be a change. And there has to be an on-ramp for states to make that change, which was part of what I felt was very reckless, but what was happening last year is that there was all of this turmoil inside of the agency and this downsizing and this shredding, but no plan for how we were going to hand things to the state. And I think that again, is reckless and leaves people worse off in a disaster.
Mm-hmm. More questions?
Thank you. MaryAnn, earlier you mentioned the concept of turning naysayers into yay-sayers, and I think that's kind of worth pausing on a little bit. How do you draw the line? And I think the show makes the really compelling case that a lot of the skepticism about FEMA is rooted in a genuine lack of prior transparency or perceived or real failures during actual emergencies. How do you draw the line between where you sort of recognize those shortcomings and try to win people over versus where you suggest maybe people are either not going to be won over or are not willing to be won over because they have a particular agenda?
Well, I have always just tried to, first of all, you got to meet people where they are, right? So you got to go out and you have to circulate in a disaster. You have to go talk to all the stakeholders, and you have to be transparent about what's possible. You have to own your mistakes. I've interacted with a lot of people in disasters. I've found, again, that most people, most groups, they want to help people, and I want to help people. And I would always kind of lead with that, like, let's talk about how we can help people together. What are you willing to do? What am I willing to do? How can we work together? And I have generally had success with that. I think, again, most people, they want to do good. Especially if you're out there helping disaster survivors. It's not like you're waking up, I don't want to help these people. I want to try to shield them from assistance. I really have never encountered that. But I think there's just a lot of mistrust and distrust because government agencies, we're like, we can't talk to those people because they've got guns and they're we got motorcycles and we're afraid. And, even when, what I told you about Nashville, like when I told our team, I was like, I'm going to go talk to these guys. They were like, you can't go there. It's not safe. And I was like, I don't think they're going to kill me. I really don't. And we just drove up and, we kind of brokered a meeting. I drove up and we talked and it was fine. And, and I think once we built a relationship, we were able to do some things together that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. And so, I think you just got to be less afraid and more willing to put yourself out there, own your mistakes, and talk about how you can work together.
Question over here.
Hi. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's kind of like a Spark Notes, which I love. I really liked what you were saying, or one poignant point that you raised, MaryAnn, was that people don't know what FEMA does, right? And I think that's actually a pretty common story for most government agencies. They're not necessarily hiring PR teams, to profile everything that they're doing. And so I'm curious, and Mamdani had a huge social media campaign, and every day we see a video now of what he's doing that day, what he's committing to, what he's signed. Huge PR team, obviously. So I'm like, is that what government now needs to do to buy back goodwill? Like, what does it mean to tell a good story from here on out to get that faith again? And does it have to be now digitalized going forward?
Well, I think part of why FEMA was just not good at telling its story, I think, again, because, we would tell parts of the story that maybe led people to have different expectations, like I mentioned about the amount of assistance you would get. I think also FEMA was reluctant to tell its story because it was afraid there would be blowback, right? So I think there was a resistance to putting out all the great things that we were doing, even though there was a lot out there. I'm not diminishing the work that our teams did to do that. But, it was like, let's tell the good story, but then we would get blowback. And so I think you do that enough, people get a little gun shy about putting themselves out there. I also think FEMA people are just really humble. We're just doing the work, and we're doing it through our state and local partners. So there's also a concern about getting out ahead of them and appearing as like we're trying to take the limelight from them, because FEMA is there in support of the governor, in support of local officials, not out there on their own. We're out there at the request of them, right? So you're always working in partnership with them, and they should be out front, because FEMA's the first, the last to arrive and the first to leave in a disaster. But that local official, that governor, they own that disaster from start to finish. That's their people. We are there to help them help their people. And so I think there was always a tension between how much FEMA would get out in front of that.
MaryAnn, have you heard from any of your former colleagues about the series and what they thought of it?
Yeah, I've heard from some folks. They liked it, It was good.
Of course they did. More questions?
Is there more to that?
Hi, I just want to follow up on that comment that someone else made about the 5,000, and then what did you say, like people think they're going to get 42,000.
Mm-hmm.
So what would happen if people, because I think what happens is people hear billions of dollars have been spent after a disaster, right? Nobody knows where that's going or where that's coming from. What would happen if FEMA was honest with people and said, realistically, you're only going to get about $5,000? You know what I'm asking? That,
yeah.
Like, how do you do that? And then the other question I have for any of you is, I'm basically a pest optimist, and so I think that what are we going to do? Me, even just as a citizen, what am I going to do? What can we do? Will these things be able to be rebuilt? Because you're telling us that it's been gutted, right?
Well, I think, in terms of the money, when there is a disaster, you can look at FEMA's press release and it'll say, we've provided $700 million to the states to rebuild, or we're deploying all these federal resources like the National Guard and the Army Corps. Well, that costs money. Those things aren't cheap. That's a lot of that billions of dollars is all of the federal resources that deploy to a disaster. And then that billions of dollars is repairing the roads, rebuilding the schools, providing housing. That's where that money is going. The individual assistance piece of a disaster is often a smaller piece. It's one of the more expensive pieces for FEMA to deliver in terms of like indirect costs, but it's usually the smaller piece of a disaster. We spend a lot more on the public assistance program, which is all the assistance we provide to state and local governments. And like I mentioned in the podcast, we treat the people who call that need assistance like they're criminals from jump. We don't treat state and local governments like that. We will give a state and local government billions of dollars. We fill out some forms. Obviously, we have a lot of oversight, but we don't give them a sheet that says, if you lie to us, we're going to lock you up. But if you call the FEMA assistance line, that is like the first thing you hear. And again, that's not like being survivor-centric. We have to retool that whole program so survivors have a better experience and also have a better understanding of what is available to them.
Last question? Or maybe that's a good spot to end. No, here we go.
Sorry. You talk about how when the militia groups show up on the emergency or in the disaster area, you went out and met them and worked with them and brought them in to like have them help. What does that process look like to go and like talk to citizens and say, hey, you've shown up to help. Come on and let's go help together. Because my imagination is sort of like, if people are showing up to a disaster zone, the response would be, please get away from here so that we can do our jobs. What does it look like to bring them in to say, okay, let's all work together? If you are not all trained together and you're not all like working together every day. How do you do that, and how do you do that effectively?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, FEMA, like, we would never turn people away from, I think there was a time in emergency management where government was like much more paternalistic and felt like only government can help you and you have to stay out and let the government take it. But that's like in a big disaster, you need all, like, people don't care where the help comes from, they just care that they got help. So whether it's the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, a pop-up group, like the librarians get together and do something, all of these groups have to contribute in a disaster, and like grassroots community assistance is the best kind of assistance because that's the assistance that's going to be there long term. So like neighbors helping neighbors, number one, we should all be supporting that, right? And there are systems in a disaster through there's a group called the Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, and their job in a disaster is to bring all those groups together, to help them weave their assistance together. And like any bunch of groups, like some of them get along better than others, and it's like, how are we going to help people? I want to help people this way. No, I want to do it that way. But I think if you can get everybody's interests aligned and try to get everybody rowing in the general same direction, you're going to get a lot more assistance out of that than having people work in a fragmented way. And so FEMA helps with that. The VOAD, that's what they call it, VOAD helps with that. But it's a team, emergency management is a team sport. Everybody's got a role to play, and we have to work together as a team.
Well, thank you all for listening to the show. Listening to the podcast and coming out tonight. Thanks for coming. Good night.